We have 5 minutes for questions. If there aren't any from the audience, I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative to ask one. But Chuck? Yeah. Oh, we've moved from Phil Donahue to Ellen.
Dance.
I think this question is for Alan. So in terms of some of the things you talked about, Alan, and some of the things that Austin was talking about, how often is a result of a performance review of a state has PHMSA reduced funding for a state?
I can't give you specifics, but I mean it's the top amount of funding they could get. It's 80%, but it's quite often that there are points deductions which do impact their funding level. So not all receive it. It's not like all 51 receive 80%. It varies from the 60s to 80, or close to 80.
So it's fairly common as a result of a performance review, and they get points deducted that as a follow-up to that, their grant funding's reduced? We
do deduct points which do impact grant funding, yes. It may be due to staffing levels that they're not able to maintain, though, that can affect funding, training levels, oversight of coverage of pipeline safety, the various items that we have in our goals that are in our annual performance review.
Hello, thank you all for your comments. My name is Tom Hutchings. I'm from Mobile, Alabama, and I have a question, I guess, to you, Alan, again. You identified 9 states, and I think it was done, who have taken on interstate authority. I would like to know perhaps who some of those might be and the impetus for them doing so. And did the request come from the states themselves?
Yeah, typically it does come from the states, yes. And if they meet the requirements for the base program, then we entertain their ability to oversee interstate. To give you a couple of examples, Minnesota handles hazardous liquid forces, does Virginia. Washington State, I can't miss Washington State as well, hazardous liquid, yeah. Arizona, yeah. Well, I should give deference to my fellow panel member here. Sorry, Robert, yeah. Yeah.
The question for the webcast was there a follow-up of why some states have requested that?
Speaking for Arizona, Arizona felt that it was necessary for us to be involved in every aspect of pipeline safety within our state. One of the primary core reasons is just staying involved in all aspects of safety. I mean, that's why we take it on. We don't get any extra money for it. We don't get any extra points for it. Matter of fact, if we do a poor job, we'll get penalized for it, and we'll lose our agent status. So first and foremost, though, we have to make sure we take care of all the interstate pipelines within our state. And if you're not doing your interstate work, you certainly can't take, you're not going to be considered as an interstate agent if you're not doing your own in-state work. So I think it's also a significant a benchmark for a state to step up and take that responsibility. We are responsible to the citizens of our state for everything that happens within it, and that's our philosophy. And we do have more work with less money and less staff every year, but that does not relinquish us from our obligation to do the best job that we can. We will get the job done no matter what.
And in Washington State, just to answer that question, the state legislature, and correct me if I'm wrong, David, directed the state administration to take on that role after a tragedy. That's what, right.
And I do have 2 openings.
Carl, I have one question for Alan also. After the OIG audit becomes public, and I know that you're undertaking work in anticipation of that audit with NAPSR and so forth. How quickly can we expect a response from PHMSA in terms of changes in the way that the state certification process occurs? Is that something that you can do without having to undertake a rulemaking, or are we looking at a 4-year lag time from whenever that starts?
Well, I'd have to say that, with some of the initiatives we have going on now that, we are addressing some of what we expect to come out in the audit. I don't, it all depends, too, on what's in the report and how long it would take for a response. So I have to qualify it with that. But I don't anticipate with what I've seen to date that we would have to anticipate rulemaking or expect rulemaking.
Okay.
Sure. Let me explain a little bit of the report process. We issue a draft report to PHMSA with what we call findings and then a series of recommendations to address those findings. And we're looking for their formal comments to the draft report, which we evaluate, and then we go final. Now, we can consider any changes that they propose, but that's really left up to us. Then, as we evaluate their responses to the recommendations, it really matters whether they concur or non-concur with the recommendations. If they do concur and they provide actions planned or actions taken, we'll evaluate those before we consider the recommendation. Well, first of all, we evaluate them to see if they're responsive to the recommendations. And if they are, then we evaluate whether or not to close that recommendation. So that process, once the final report is issued, really depends on their response and whether they were responsive to the recommendations. And we can close the recommendation immediately, or maybe we'll have to wait until the action taken or the action plan has actually been taken, which could be up to a year or more. So that's how that process works.
Appreciate you connecting that dot, Scott, because we're ways off from the final report. For comparison, it has this liquid integrity management audit that there were 9 recommendations out of, and the process for closing these recommendations is not quite as lengthy as, from my experience, as it is, say, for NTSB recommendations. It can be, but for instance, for that audit, I believe we've already closed out like 5 of the 9. And I expect that we will, obviously, as I said, we take these seriously and we'll address them as quickly as we can.
Okay. I'd like to thank our panelists, and I think we go to a break now. Is that right, Carl?
Yeah, 10-minute break.